World War II, Germany and France, and Cold War, Pakistan and Iran. I'm the proud graduate of the Tehran American High School. As a child, as a girl child in Europe, leadership was something that men did outside the family. And the only female leadership role model I had was Joan of Arc. And look at what happened to her when she got onto a pair of pants and got on a horse. I mean, when I think of it in retrospect, that's a terrible thing. It never occurred to me that I could be a leader because I was female. I was not male, tall, good looking with a deep voice, which is how we like our leaders. It was not until I began to train lawyers in management skills that I became aware of the fact that management and part of leadership is skill-based. Many of us are using those skills, especially women are using those skills in alternative venues, often in the house, and we don't even consider that we have leadership skills. I first introduced leadership training to the Department of State in the 1980s. Didn't do too well, but I tried. And the leadership theorists at the time were moving from the great man theory of leadership, which our president still practices today, to other styles of leadership accommodating the groups that people are leading. Why are the styles changing? Well, because people are changing, and leadership is, very simply, a process. This is the clearest definition I have found by Peter Northouse. It is a process by which one individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. That's leadership. It is not the same as management. A lot of the skills are the same, and all leaders manage, and most managers have opportunities to lead, but the emphasis is different. As we move, as the world changes, people change, and the groups of individuals change, so does the process. And we are in a process of leadership style change that the theorists are talking about. And the shift is from transactional leadership to transformational leadership. Transactional leadership is something we all know because we grew up in it in school. Right? The focus is on the goal. The teacher comes and says, the professor comes and says, all right, in order for me to give you an A, a recommendation, whatever, in the Foreign Service, it was a good evaluation, a promotion, an onward assignment, you need to accomplish these goals to my satisfaction. It is a method of motivating people through external rewards and punishments. As I say, it is one in which we have lived many of our organizational lives. It is highly reactive, and it helps to maintain the status quo, right? When things are working well, we use to maintain policies and systems in our organizations, a form of transactional interaction with people in the organization. Transformational leadership comes with change. I think all leadership is about change. If you don't need change, then just manage. However, there are times when creating change by forming groups that share a vision of the change and are motivated by the vision and the enthusiasm of working in the group, that makes it transformational, both in creating the change and in making the leader and the group highly motivated and morally better, according to the people who came up with the definition of transformational leadership. We do it because it is meaningful to us. We want to accomplish it. And the process of accomplishing is in itself motivating. Got it? I didn't know any of this at the time that I was in the Foreign Service. These styles of leadership were not being addressed. But I sure did run into the issue of transactional leadership when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary. Rob Jackson was in the Africa Bureau at the same time. And I was what I call the policy stuckee for the Rwanda genocide. This was the most transactional policy that I had been confronted with at a very personal level. I had been in Rwanda only 10 days before the plane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi was shot out of the sky, which unleashed a immediate chaos, reignited the civil war, and put into place perpetrators of a genocide that killed over 800,000 people in the space of 100 days. When the plane went down, we in the Africa Bureau did what we are supposed to do, which is to take care of American citizens. And we, an interagency in Washington and around the world, became a highly motivated group of people with a mission to get all Americans out alive. We did. We actually added an American because a woman gave birth. And as soon as the Americans were out, the White House, National Security Council, made the decision that we would remove the peacekeepers in the face of what everybody recognized was going to be mass slaughter. Here was the discussion that I heard time after time. It is not in our national security interest to intervene. Never mind that we know thousands of people are going to be slaughtered. Since there's no more peace, the Civil War has broken out at the same time as a genocide, then why would we have peacekeepers? So we remove the peacekeepers. Once those decisions were taken, we as a interagency community in Washington, D.C. had not one single new idea as to how to approach it. If it wasn't hard power and boots on the ground, then what do we do? I ended up picking up the telephone and using pathetic soft power to talk to one of the perpetrators and to tell him that he was going to be held personally responsible. And I'm happy to say, one of the very few things that gives me satisfaction is when I was in Nairobi, the prosecutors for the Rwanda Tribunal stopped by, courtesy call, they were going to Cameroon to pick up this guy I had been talking to. He's now in jail. But it was transactional. At no point did the discussion go to how do we save people's lives without endangering necessarily American lives. Never got to that. I was given, for my efforts, I was assigned as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Kenya in 1998. It took me a nanosecond. First time I drove in front of that horrible black, not black, but brown lunchbox of a building, that I saw this is not a safe building. It did not meet American government standards for security. It didn't meet foreign State Department standards of security. And I had been what people fondly call disaster Daz for 3 years, and I jolly well knew an unsafe building when I saw it, and began efforts for 2 years to get the Department of State to sell that awful building, use the proceeds to buy land and start building a new building, and I was told no. several times. A year into it, I was told to stop nagging. As an aside, U.S. ambassadors are the only, I believe, Senate-confirmed political appointees in the U.S. government to actually have, oh my God, a job description and a machine-signed letter from the President of the United States outlining responsibilities, and that includes the personal responsibility for the safety of all American citizens in country, to say nothing of the responsibility as chief of mission for all employees. So back in Washington, I was being told to stop nagging because I was taking my responsibility for the security too seriously. I eventually wrote the Secretary of State because I was so concerned, a personal letter to the Secretary that was hand-delivered. And 3 months later, I will point you to this photograph. It was taken actually a day after the bombing, which is why things look pretty grim. But if you will see the circle, you'll see the small building that was our embassy and a high-rise building. 2 perps in 1 pickup truck with 1,000 pounds of explosives went into a very small parking lot in between the high-rise building and the low building and detonated 1,000 pounds of explosives, which, because the blast took place in an area that was surrounded by buildings in 3 parts, just massively expanded. I happened to have been, at the time, at the very top, in an office building at the very top of the high-rise building. And when we heard the first perp hurled a stun grenade, people came to the windows throughout the downtown area, including people in the office in which I was. I was the last person, for whatever reason. The bomb blast threw me across the room. I was unconscious for a very short time. Fortunately, only superficially wounded. And when I came down those endless flights of stairs with hundreds of bleeding Kenyans and came out of the building, I knew that that was one of the sights that I saw, that we had no choice but to get in gear. And I somehow, I goofed up on providing dignified access to free groceries. That came from another slide, do forgive me. At the moment of the bombing, 213 people died. 12 Americans, 101 Kenyans, 34 of our Kenyan employees were blown up. A busload of little boys ended up with glass in their eyes. It was absolutely horrific. And as I look back on what happened, the way we got out was through transformational leadership, although I didn't know it at the time. Talk about abrupt change. I mean, there's nothing like having your building blown up, like having moms blown up and their dads stay with the orphans to transform your status quo. So what I have done is to take the 4 I's and put it into the context of what we went through in the aftermath of the bombing to show you what it really looked like and why, for me, transformational leadership is a no-brainer. All right, 4 I's. Intellectual stimulation. You like what you are moving toward, because what you are moving toward is it's a vision that is inspired. So you have inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, idealized influence, which is essentially serving as a role model, and individualized consideration, which means taking every person into account and not just the organization as a whole. All right, let's see what happened. Okie dokie, you want intellectual stimulation? That's what one of our offices look like. Challenge to the status quo, darn straight. Encourage creativity. How do you go from here to recreate your organization? And of course, we encourage new ways of doing things because that was what the old way looked like. And did we get opportunities to learn? I should say so. My job was to make sure that people had the resources and the environment in which they could do that. It also meant that my job was to make sure that people allowed one another to do that. So don't, criticize another person's idea if you don't have a better one. And doing nothing, by the way, was never an option in this situation. Inspirational motivation. I had spent with my husband 2 years before the bombing working on the fact that Nairobi, Kenya had the reputation for having very low morale. Always has, always will, I was told. Well, nonsense to that. So we brought community together. I had people, all newcomers began in my office as they could see what the ambassador's office looked like, and ended up, the debriefings, the orientation ended up at the residence where my husband was all too glad to take them through our private quarters. When he hit the bedroom, I said, stop, that's, the kitchen's fine. But so we had we had focused on a community, as a community. And of course, that was one of the reasons why I was sending these cables back, and my community knew I was sending cables back because they felt unsafe in that building. The very first night, the only communication we had was our handheld radio set through Marine Post 1, and I got on the radios and said, we're going to get through this, and we're going to get through this together. As a senior policy team, when we got together, we made it a policy that we sent to Washington that we would put people first. And my mantra when we all took refuge in the Agency for International Development building in the suburbs was be kind to yourselves and be kind to one another, because we were cheek to jowl. I mean, thank goodness OSHA never visited. One of the things that I found was really important for inspirational motivation was to celebrate milestones and get back to our traditions. And one of the traditions of the U.S. Embassy community on New Year's Eve was to go to the Nairobi Game Park and have a sundowner. Those of us who survived the bombing were there. Somebody put Auld Lang Syne on her radio tape, and we looked at this view, we hugged, tears came down, and this to me was a sign that we were going to do it. If this isn't inspirational motivation, then I don't know what is. Individualized consideration. Well, it was not difficult to consider people as individuals, because each and every one of us who survived that incident, whether we were in the building itself or not, were impacted by it. And I might as well wish my brown eyes blue as to wish that others didn't respond to trauma the way they did. We also had enormous acts of courage. Under individualized consideration, the experts say keeping lines of communications is critically important, so that followers, unquote, I don't like the word follower, but there you go, feel free to share ideas. Okay, this is the picture of the Peace Park that is now located on the site of the old American Embassy building and its neighbor. When we were blown up, we at the embassy wanted to turn the U.S. Embassy site into a peace park, and I went back to Washington and I was told, no, the State Department doesn't do parks, and anyway, we do not own the land. Your job is to raise the building, grass over the land, and hand that piece of land back to the Kenyan government. I have to say, by the time I got this instruction, I was really tired. I had rattled a lot of cages and subsequently learned, pretty much ruined my career aspirations for the future by some of the things that had happened, and was ready to give up. I announced, I'm sorry, but this is what Washington has said, and our agricultural attaché, speaks up, not a part of the senior team, part of the extended senior team, says, you can't do that. You know exactly what's going to happen. President Moi's cronies are going to grab the land, they're going to put an apartment building or an office building on it, and no one will ever know what ever happened there. And when he was talking, I had one of those terrible oh shit moments. He's right. So what did we do? Our econ commercial and other people went out to the American business and Kenyan business communities, and they organized a foundation and money that would go into the foundation. People came up with design ideas, volunteer design ideas, and my job was to get President Moi to agree to donate the land for a park. And here is how I did it. Every single cocktail party I went to, I would slide up to the corrupt minister I knew had his eyes on the land and bat my big brown eyes and say, Mr. Minister, may I have a word? Smile and say, would you please support my effort to turn that part of the land into a peace park for all citizens of Kenya? And this is the result. Had the ag attaché not spoken up, that would not be there. Talk about individual consideration and why I think dissent is really important. If somebody's dissenting, then we need to listen to what they have to say. And that starts with this country. Idealized influence. The last one. I was very, very attentive and knowledgeable about how much attention I was getting. I mean, good heavens, the press was around me all the time. So I knew people were looking at me. One of the things I decided, I would never wear black, never. I wanted that SOB who tried to kill us. And by the way, I found out later that bin Laden chose that embassy because it had a female ambassador. I wanted those people to see me in pink, and I wore pink and green and so forth. I also had worked to earn respect before I became the leader of such an injured community. And I found that as a woman, my repertoire of possible behaviors was so much larger than it would have been had I been a male ambassador. So the very first night after we were bombed at 10 o'clock at night, I handed the crisis center over to people who hadn't been in the building, who were relatively fresh. And I told everybody who had, I want you to go home and I want you to cry. Because that's what I'm going to do. I actually didn't because I was in too much shock. But I wanted no stiff upper lips. I wanted a resilient community for the long term. A very dear friend of mine sent me this poster about courage, and I put it down by our very, very slow elevator to remind cranky people, in a hurry to get to their office. That courage sometimes doesn't always roar, and we'll try again tomorrow. Personal lessons that I learned from this experience. I have many, many leadership lessons I have learned, but here are some of the personal ones as I think about the experience from the lens of a transformational leadership prism. This was in a high just came to, and I'm thinking, well, why didn't it occur to us before? Leadership theorists need to understand that groups can happily exist without leaders. Leaders cannot exist without a group. So, with all of this attention that we in this country are putting on leadership, well, I'm one of them. But how about group? And that good, effective, they've done studies on this. People who are effective group members become effective leaders. And as I thought back on members of the team in Nairobi after the bombing, the numbers of people who went on to very senior positions didn't surprise me because they were really good group members and they became good leaders. Studies have shown that women are very comfortable with transformational leadership, whereby men are very comfortable with transactional. And when I thought about it, it occurred to me that that makes sense because for so many centuries, women have never had the external rewards and punishments to use. Right? So we have had to use, as mothers, as people getting the kids out, as teachers getting people excited, we have had to use transformational, look at what we're doing and aren't we having fun, and so forth, as a means to help create change. The final personal lesson I learned, fortunately, came into my head about 20 hours after the bombing. We were blown up on August 7th, on Friday, Saturday, August 8th. My presence is required at a number of different venues, including the telephone to talk to Secretary of State, and a note that a wonderful mentor had written me came into my mind, and the note had said, take care of your people and the rest will take care of itself. That became my leadership philosophy, my management strategy, and it works. If we want transformational leadership, then we begin by taking care of our people. And with that, I want to open this up for questions. So I'm going to